Teidai Dempo Buso no Myogo Bibashi Butsu Shiki Butsu Bishafu Butsu Kudazon Butsu Kunagamuni Butsu Kasha Butsu Shakamuni Butsu Makakasha Sonja Anan Sonja Shona Washu Sonja Ubaki Kuta Sonja Daitaka Sonja Mishaka Sonja Bashu Mesa Sonja Buddha. What the Buddha taught. 4. The path out of pain. Last time we looked at the Four Noble Truths and the Middle Way, which was the first turning of the wheel of the Dharma, the first teachings that the Buddha gave, if we remember, to those 5 ascetics in the deer park at Benares. Today we're going to look at the 4th of the Four Noble Truths, otherwise known as the Noble Eightfold Path, also known as the Path of the Arhat. And the Arhat comes from a Sanskrit term, Arya, which means noble or the noble one. And the path that the Arhats take is the path to nirvana, from samsara, which is the world of suffering, to nirvana, which is the world of peace. And quite literally, nirvana comes from the Sanskrit verb nirv, meaning to blow out or to extinguish, rather like a candle, for example. And in this case, the flames that it refers to, or the fires that it refers to, are the fires of what are known as the kleshas, or the passions. The fire of wanting, the fire of aversion or hatred and fear, and also the fire of delusion, which we will be looking at in more detail. So, just to continue with what we were talking about last week, if we remember that the Four Noble Truths encapsulated the Buddha's diagnosis of why it is that human beings suffer. And of course, suffering, or dukkha, is central to the teachings of Buddhism. Suffering I teach, and the way out of suffering was how the Buddha himself summed up what his teachings were about. And this suffering, again, this dukkha, this dissatisfactoriness, it's a term that has multiple meanings, not just pain as in physical pain, but also mental pain, emotional pain, spiritual pain, and even deeper than that, just a sense of restlessness or dissatisfactoriness, the fact that we cannot go for very long without somehow feeling disturbed or upset or wanting things to be different. We get bored and so on. There are always these constant judgments that I am making. And so the path out of this dukkha, the Buddha laid out in the last of the Four Noble Truths, the Noble Eightfold Path. And just very quickly, possibly if you've read anything about Buddhism, you will have come across this. Undoubtedly, we have right seeing or right views, which is the first, and right intention, sometimes also called right thought, then right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right awareness, and right meditation. And these 8 stages are not something that's done, one by one by one. Normally they're pictured as a wheel, an 8-spoked wheel, and one traverses all of them from the outer rim towards the still center. So this is how we picture them. And we'll notice, obviously, that each of the stages is prefaced by this term that's translated into English, right. And this right is not a moral right exactly. The word it comes from is samma, and samma literally means peerless or supreme, beyond which one cannot go, because it's perfect, or as perfect as possible. And perhaps if we just put this into a little bit of context, when we're looking at this term samma or peerlessness, it's rather like, for example, when you do those sort of surveys, and you give a sort of you're given a range of scores. So it goes from poor to average to good to excellent. And then so you have this range over which you can score something. And it's the same with Sama. Sama is sort of like at the very supreme end, the excellent end, something that cannot be surpassed. Because if we look at these 8, obviously they're things that we're familiar with. We all see, we all think, we all speak, and we act, we live. We make an effort, we also can be aware, and we also can meditate as well. We may not always call it meditation, but we can do so. Obviously, we have a formal meditation practice, but people who sort of sit quietly in a chair, perhaps looking out over the garden, or go fishing or something like that, and just sit by the riverbank, for example, often will enter into a meditative state. It's a state of absorption, which we'll look at a little bit later on. So we do all these things already, but, and this is the rub, the way that we do them is not necessarily sama, is not necessarily complete. We lie upon a range of things. So our speech and our actions, for example, may be supreme from time to time, and at other times they may be otherwise, may not be so. So what the Buddha is really saying with this practice formulation, because that's what the Noble Eightfold Path is, it's something to be practiced, something to be implemented, is that we engage in a practice that moves all of those 8 stages over towards the Samma end of the scale, so that it becomes supreme. Our seeing becomes clear. We see things as they really are. Our intentions become pure, that is, that they become empty of selfishness, for example, and so on. And the same with our speech and our action and our livelihood. So this was the sort of ground plan, and important just to say before we look at it in a little bit more detail, is that this the Noble Eightfold Path, obviously one of the came through from one of the first teachings that the Buddha actually gave, is very much the central practice in early Buddhism. This was the way it was done. The Sangha, the ordained Sangha, the nuns and the monks, when they went out into the forest, this is what they were implementing. The practice of the Noble Eightfold Path. Obviously, if we know a little bit about Buddhist history, we will know that there was a development in Buddhism called the Mahayana, which came along a little bit later, and produced a range of other practices. It wasn't a different form of Buddhism, it was a development, an amplification of certain things. I mean, Buddhism too is also subject to change and impermanence and transformation. And the Mahayana innovated a number of changes, and one important change was the central practice formulation. So whereas in the early Buddhism we have the Noble Eightfold Path, in later Buddhism, in the Mahayana, we had what was a practice formulation called the 6 parameters, sometimes also known as the 10 parameters. Actually, these also existed in early Buddhism as well, but they became the focus of attention for the Mahayana. So that's just to put that in. However, we shouldn't think that somehow the Noble Eightfold Path has been superseded. Not at all. This is the path out of suffering. And if we remember that the whole of Buddhism, Mahayana included, is about the path out of suffering. There are simply different formulations, as there are different teachings and different practices, because of the many different capacities of human beings. And so this is why. It's not that one is better than another, it's just that in certain situations, certain practices are emphasized because they fit better. It has been found. So we will continue now just looking a little bit at in more detail at those 8 stages. And the other thing just to say about those 8 stages is, in fact, they can be divided up. into what are known as the three pillars of Buddhism. The three pillars of Buddhism are wisdom, discipline, and meditation. And we start with the wisdom pillar, because the wisdom pillar encapsulates the first two stages of the Noble Eightfold Path, which is right views or right seeing, and right intention. So those two make up the pillar of wisdom. And we may sort of think, well, surely wisdom is what comes out of doing the practice. Why is it there at the very beginning? It's there at the very beginning because people who develop the incentive to undertake a Buddhist practice already have come to a realization that the constant round of chasing after things doesn't bring any lasting satisfaction. In fact, can even make things worse. And this is really where human beings begin to step out of impulsive living, constantly going after what they want and running away anxious from those things that they don't like. It's, if you like, where a stand is made when one realizes that this is surely not the only way to live, and it certainly can't be the best way to live either. And in particular, that with that first stage, the ability to be able to see that, the ability to be able to, as it were, to stand back and reflect on the to reflect on the circumstances of one's own life with hindsight, and to see whether this is really the way that we wish to continue. That is the beginning of wisdom. If we lacked that capacity to reflect, then we simply would not be able to help ourselves along this Noble Eightfold Path. It would be closed to us. And this is really why the Buddha said only human beings can follow the Noble Eightfold Path and become and have the capacity to be liberated. And we talked previously, when we looked at the Buddha's life story, and particularly when we were looking at that birth of the Buddha, and we asked, well, what is the Buddha? And it was put forward that the Buddha is what was called sati, or this reflective awareness. It's precisely that capacity that is being developed through this Noble Eightfold Path, so that in the end, seeing things as they really are, we can see with hindsight the consequences of where we are, and also if we continue down a certain path, we only create more suffering, and therefore we are able to avoid it. One example that we can give, for example, if you imagine a summer's day and you're sitting in a warm room with the window open, and as sometimes happens, a fly flies in through the window. It flies around a little bit and then it wants to leave, and so it goes back to the window. It's attracted to the light coming in, but it can't differentiate between the glass window pane and the opening that would allow it to leave, and so it just sort of hits the window again and again and again, and then it flies around the room, and then it comes back to the window because it has to. It's attracted to the light, and but it continues to do so. And if we did nothing to help it, for example, we eventually finish what we're doing, we close the window, we leave, we come back the next day, and there on the floor in front of the window is the dead fly. It starved to death. It just ran out of power and died. And it was imprisoned by its own ignorance. It could not tell where the window was, and even though on many occasions it may have flown very close to the opening, it just missed it because it was purely random where it was going. And unfortunately, in this case, it didn't make it. And this can mirror our own situation if we are too emired in circumstances that are unhealthy for us, or unhealthy for us collectively as well. And why do we do this sort of thing? Well, the old adage, "There's none so blind as those who do not wish to see," and this holds a lot of truth. We see things that we expect to see. In fact, our mind and our hearts create many of our expectations and shape our perception and shape and create our experience. And the Buddha gave a good parable of this, of a man who was walking home in the twilight. And this is in India at the time of the Buddha. And before him in the half-light he saw a snake lying across the road, and with shock and fear he turns to run the other way. But the Buddha happens to be standing there, and so says to the man, "Look again." And so the man does look again, and looking more closely this time, he realizes that what he thought was a snake in the half-light was actually a piece of old rope. And so, thank goodness, with a sigh he goes to step over it, and the Buddha says, "Pick it up." And so this time again he stoops down and he picks it up and brings it close to his eyes, where he suddenly realizes it's not a piece of old rope at all. It's actually a string of gems. And now so we see three different perceptions, three different reactions, yet it was always the same object. And this is why right views is right at the very beginning of the Noble Eightfold Path, because how we see something conditions what we think, what we speak, what we do, how we live, and all the rest of it. In other words, if the seeing is wrong, if it's not Sama, then our thought, our expectations, our speech and our actions, and the way that we live our life in our relationships, so forth, can be damaged by that ignorance, can be damaged by that false view or that wrong view. If it's right, then our thought, speech and action flows out of it. Hence why clear seeing is so incredibly important. And this really links in Buddhism the insight practice with the way out of suffering. This is why we practice meditation and why we practice daily life practice, sometimes called the mindfulness practice, so that we are cultivating clear seeing, developing that capacity of sati, of reflection in our daily lives, and through that then everything else flows from it. So that was the first one. Obviously the second one, the other string to wisdom's bow, is right intention. This is the right intention to act, and this is highlighted really because our selfishness, our self-absorbedness, which because the Buddha said that the selfishness is actually a delusive form of thinking. It has to be laid down as part of the practice. Hence why we practice selflessness and cultivate that selflessness as well. And it's very subtle, even in spiritual matters. There's a story from the Zen tradition about the 28th Indian patriarch known as Bodhidharma, who was also the first Chinese patriarch. And he brought the spirit of Buddhism and of Zen over from India into China. And the story goes that he had a very important interview with the Emperor of China. And the Emperor of China at that time was a Buddhist convert. Buddhism had been in China for quite a while, but it was a very early form of Buddhism, and really the spirit of it hadn't been transplanted. And the story goes, for those who don't know it, the emperor was very keen to see Bodhidharma because he was a genuinely ardent Buddhist, and so Bodhidharma slightly reluctantly turned up. And as was the custom, before the emperor made his entrance, then the court vizier would obviously announce that the emperor was about to come, would give all his names, would usually give all his achievements, and this usually involved battles that he had won and territories that he gained and wealth that he had acquired and so on. But for this Buddhist emperor it was different. He gave all the names and so forth and his titles, royal imperial titles. And then when he listed his achievements, it was building temples and copying sutras and having them translated from Sanskrit and Pali into Chinese, and giving permission for monks and nuns to be ordained, because at that time they had to have the imperial command that allowed them to do that, and so on. And then the emperor appeared. And so the emperor's first question to Bodhidharma was, well, you've heard of all my achievements. Tell me, how much good karma has been accumulated by this? The term is actually called merit. Again, if we're not aware, in Buddhism, when we perform an intentional act, it produces a result in the future. There's an outflow or an outcome in the future, which may be wholesome, which may be unwholesome. And wholesome karma is called merit. And so the emperor said, well, okay, what sort of... And it's the belief was that this merit conditions our future rebirth, where we are reborn. And so this is what the emperor was inquiring, really. He says, what merit have I accrued from all this? In other words, where am I going to be reborn? And this is very similar, actually, to beliefs in the West about our performance on earth, deciding whether we go to heaven or whether we go to hell. It's the same sort of thing. If you keep your nose clean, you go to heaven. If you blot your copybook a bit too much, then you go down. And so Buddhism has its own equivalent. This is the way it worked. And Bodhidharma replied to this question, how much merit? He said, none whatsoever, which was not the answer that the emperor was actually looking for. And he got pretty upset by it as well. Anyway, you can read elsewhere how the rest of the interview goes. But it's an important point, because what Bodhidharma was really trying to point to the emperor was, look, the Buddha's way is about laying down of myself, the I, me and mine. And here you are doing all these wonderful things, and they are all wonderful and good, but the motivation behind it is for your own benefit. It's not really for anyone else. You would not be doing this, in other words, if you didn't get anything out of it. Or maybe what he's saying is, let's see if you carry on doing this, now that you've been told that you are not going to get anything out of this at all, nothing whatsoever. And this is it. It's so against the way of thinking of I am always thinking from the point of view of goal-oriented and something in it for me. It really is very fundamental to the way I think, and yet it shuts out a consciousness that also exists in the human heart that does not discriminate, that does not, in fact, differentiate between self and others. And there is a consciousness that is there that operates in that way, and it's important to recognize this. We have it. For example, if you go onto the London Underground and you've got those long escalators that take you down to the platform, and everyone has to stand on the right, and you can walk down on the left, and there I am standing on the right, and someone walks past me, and just as they walk past they stumble, and before even thinking about it, my arm goes out and I grab hold of them. And the person sighs a breath of relief, and simultaneously I sigh a breath of relief. But the question is, why did I do that? I mean, if he fell, he could pull me down after him, and I might hurt myself as well. But even despite that, I don't even know who this person is. He's nothing to me. Why should I care whether he falls down and hurts himself or not? But the fact is that we do. And there is a consciousness, of course, this is something that's so classically human, something that really marks out the best of us when we're in that human state, which is that empathetic consciousness. It's the consciousness that suffers with, and it's from that empathy that our ability to feel and behave compassionately compassion, which also means suffering with, appears as well. So that consciousness is there, but it gets shut out through selfish actions when we become focused on behaving in purely my own interest, then, and purely for my own benefit, however I conceive that to be, then that deeper level of consciousness out of which that empathy arises is shut out. And so that right intention is very important, and obviously in the Mahayana this was expanded to become the Bodhisattva vows, the vow to assist all sentient beings, which obviously existed in early Buddhism as well, clearly. If you have a look at the right actions and the wholesome and unwholesome actions, it becomes very clear. So those two are the wisdom pillar. And now, to support that wisdom pillar, we need to have a practice of restraint, and this appears in the next three. Right speech, right action, and right livelihood that go together makes up what's called in Sanskrit the Shila practice, S-I-L-A, or Sila practice, Shila practice. Sometimes it's translated as morality, which it certainly includes, because it includes the 5 precepts, obviously, which are just the very basic common human decencies. I mean, there's nothing particularly unique about the precepts. Not to cause as little harm as possible, not to take what's not freely given, not to indulge in sexual harm, not to engage in harmful or false speech, and to refrain from intoxication. And in one way, shape or form, I think it's sort of true to say that all moral codes obviously are based on this, and fundamentally it's based on the practice of what's called ahimsa, or harmlessness. Just a couple of things to say about this, because I think it's fair to say that most of us, I'm sure, know what we are supposed to do and how we're supposed to act, and we probably don't really need lecturing on it right now. Obviously, it's a different question as to whether we always do it. We probably don't, and that then begs the question, because we're always cultivating wisdom and insight, is to look into why we don't, even though when we know it's for the best. So that's one thing just to say. But the other thing to say on this ahimsa is, because obviously it is an ideal, but the truth is that we live in an imperfect world. We live in a world of the First Noble Truth, where existence itself entails a certain amount of suffering. Things are born, and things exist for a duration in relationship to others, and then things decay and die. And bad things happen, pleasant things happen. Nature red in tooth and claw. Today I eat you, and tomorrow you eat me, as well. And okay, we can say, well, okay, I'm not going to eat meat, or something like that. And that might be symbolically how we decide to practice ahimsa, to remind ourselves that all things do suffer. But we shouldn't think that therefore, even if I'm a vegan, that I can escape causing harm. I can't. My very existence impinges on others, and why should it be that plant life should be less valued than animal life? After all, plants are the only living things on this planet that don't have to kill something else that's alive in order to exist, because they can manufacture their food from sunshine, carbon dioxide and water. Of course we as human animals would value other animal lives because they're more like us than plants are, obviously, but that's a prejudice of ours, because we identify more closely with furry animals. After all, don't we feel a closer kinship to a cat than a snake? Maybe if we had scales and we were cold-blooded, we wouldn't feel so warm towards cat videos on Facebook. We all have our own points of view, which are cultivated by what we identify with, and here we are back with I again. So the point is that if we want to live this perfect, idyllic, ideal life, it's just not going to happen. Or the only way we can do it is by blinding ourselves and making assumptions and pretending that we are speaking objective facts when actually we are just voicing our own opinions, which encapsulate our prejudices. And these things go very, very deep. There's no doubt about it. So, however, that's not to say that the vegetarian life or the vegan life, is somehow a false one. Personally, I don't think it is at all. Because, as I say, if it's lived, that there's a symbolic message there as well. Which can be important too. However, that's not to say if you're a meat eater you can't be a Buddhist. The Buddha also made it very clear that being a vegetarian was a noble life, but that the eating of meat does not prohibit one from walking the Buddha's way. And we might as well deal with the other, eating and drinking as well, because some people get a bit worked up thinking that they can never have a beer or a glass of wine ever again. Well, it's true. In some places, the last precept is very strict, saying refrain from alcohol and drugs. But I think it's probably fair to say that a lot of Buddhists, and certainly a lot of Western Buddhists, though not exclusively so, do certainly drink alcohol, but intoxication is warned against. But don't forget, intoxication isn't just limited to drink and drugs. It's also we can become intoxicated by the passions as well. We can become intoxicated by ideals. We can become intoxicated by my opinions as well. And even if I drink half a bottle of whiskey and get thoroughly blasted, at least tomorrow I will be sober. But if I'm intoxicated with a conviction about something, I don't even know I'm intoxicated half the time. So again, these things can be looked at in different ways, and personally I find it useful just to keep an open mind about these things, but always following the Buddha's advice, not when it comes to the middle way as well. And it's for each of us really to find out what that is in our own life. So speech, action and livelihood. Speech and action there. Obviously the obvious things about false speeches and lying and so forth. In fact, interestingly, the Buddha once said, when it came to speech, he once came across his monks, and I'm sure you can imagine, when the Buddha walks into a room, everybody stops talking and looks up and sits up a little bit more straight. And this sudden silence sort of descended. And the Buddha said, "What were you talking about before I came in?" And one of them replied, "Oh, we were talking about the Dharma, about the teachings." And the Buddha nodded and said, "Good, good." He said, "If you're talking about the Dharma, then that's absolutely fine, carry on. But if you're not talking about the Dharma, then it's probably better to stay silent." Well, obviously this is for the monks who are living that very intense life, but for us who are, presumably I'm speaking to a majority of lay Buddhists here, we can still take the spirit of that, because even in our ordinary speech, how we address each other, how we carry out our relationships with others in the workplace, or with family and friends, or just with strangers we meet in the street, there's still, even if we don't actually speak about the Buddha's teachings, and after all, it would be a pretty good way to get yourself ostracized if you went preaching in the street or in your workplace about the Buddha and Buddhism, unwanted. However, the spirit of what the Buddha spoke about, ahimsa and careful speech and being helpful and skillful speech and so forth, well, it's up to us to find ways of implementing that. How do we transpose the spirit of the Buddha's teachings into our ordinary daily life when it comes to speech? That's the task that lies before us. And the same with our actions as well, acts of body also. How we go about Even when it comes to the little things. For example, when we go to the temples, we wouldn't just sort of sit putting our feet up on the table and sort of leaning back in the chair and plonking all our stuff in the middle of a gangway so that other people have to skirt round it or step over it. It's an inconvenience. We would be aware that if we're being if we're inconveniencing others, we would be aware if we're making other people uncomfortable, and then we would restrain it, we'd do something about it. And of course, when we practice this restraint, this is where we discover where the attachments are. It might be that when I'm upset, I have a habit of then going around provoking others to make them upset, because really what I'm saying by that is, look how upset I am. Now you know how I feel when I make you upset, and we end up in a blazing row. But there are more skillful ways of dealing with our own upset. And there's nothing wrong with being upset; it's perfectly natural. But there are ways of dealing with it. It's rather like sometimes when people come in and say, "Well, does this mean we have to become a doormat?" No, we don't have to become a doormat, but we don't have a hissy fit and throw ourselves on the floor and have a complete tantrum either. Because we may be perfectly and even justifiably upset. There are human ways of dealing with this, and it's up to us to work out what those are and to create the ethic that we will implement in our own life. And Buddhism is very strong on this. We are not going to be punished by some deity for our transgressions. We will be punished by the people and situations around us when we do things wrong, in a very real way. And so it's up to us to recognize the futility and the hurts that causes, and to be moved by that. This is the compassion, this is the deeper level of consciousness that recognizes that we are not an isolated unit in the universe, and that we would do something about it. And so correct ourselves because we want to. The whole thing about ethical living is not that I have to do it, I should do it. There's always this sense that I don't really want to do this, but I should do this. This really shows a sort of split inside between what Freud called the ego and the superego, and the id as well. That we have that voice, that wagging finger, that God Almighty complex that lives not in the sky but actually lives in us when it comes to it. So it's through that practice of restraint we discover a lot of things about the state of our own heart, where those sticking points are, what really upsets us, why it upsets us, and so forth, and what happens when we become upset, all the different defense mechanisms that we have, all the ways we have to avoid difficult situations, and so on. So then we come on to the final three, just to finish off with, and that's right effort, right awareness, and right meditation. And in the last talk in this series on the Satipatthana, on the four foundations of awareness, we will be going into considerably more detail with this. But we'll just give a sort of overview for now. This now is the practice of meditation, and just to remind ourselves that the Buddha made clear in the Satipatthana Sutta that meditation takes place in what are known as the four classical positions of sitting, which is obviously sitting meditation we're familiar with, standing, walking, and some of us may have also practiced walking meditation on retreats and so forth, and lying down. So sitting, standing, walking, and lying down. Really what this refers to is in short, all the activities of our daily life. So that includes washing up, it includes putting the magazines back in the magazine rack, it includes walking to the bus stop, it includes driving the car, it includes doing the filing, typing the letter, attending the meeting, making a cup of coffee, and so on. And this is all practiced with the right effort and the right awareness and right meditation. And this right effort, just to say that right effort means making the effort. We are obviously well aware, anyone who's practiced any sitting meditation or practiced it or has a mindfulness practice will know that a lot of the time we are carried off with our thoughts and our daydreams whilst we're walking down the street and even driving the car and doing the washing up. These are things that I don't necessarily regard as very important. I don't need to stay there. The body can do them. Meanwhile, I will listen to music or watch TV or do whatever, or even just play about in my own fantasies. And here we have that split in consciousness, and that split in consciousness, that divided heart, that divided consciousness is the realm of samsara, it's the realm of I. Why is it the realm of I? Because there's a judgment there. Actually, the body is always in the here and now. The body is right where everything is happening. It's right at the source of life. And yet when something comes up and the body's doing something like the ironing, and I don't find the ironing very interesting, I prefer to divorce myself from that source of life and disappear off into the never never. And so our practice is to make the effort to give ourselves wholeheartedly back into the body and what at this moment is being done anyway. Terrible thing really to think that we ignore the body to a great deal. I mean, we pamper it and we send it to the gym and we send it for a massage or a facial, and we adorn it in our fashions and so forth. But do we really love it? Are we even friendly enough with it to bother staying around it? It's a little bit like if you say, you have a friend, oh, I want you to be my best friend. And then when your friend starts saying something that you're not that interested with, you just sort of shove them in the cupboard underneath the stairs, and go off and do something else. And every so often you come back and sort of pull them out and, see how they are. And you sort of dress them up and feed them, what you think is good for them, taking no account of them whatsoever. It's a sad thing, and important to actually. Sometimes people don't realize just how strong a physical practice that a meditation practice and a mindfulness daily life practice is, and it's very physical as well. And this is also where that right effort is made. We make that effort to move with the body, not in a half-hearted way, but in a wholehearted way. Really give ourselves wholeheartedly into what at this moment's being done. And what happens is, as we cultivate this, is we begin to live in the body a little bit more. We are more, as the saying goes, at home in the body. And we become rested with it, and we discover that restlessness, that tendency to always be going off when I'm a little bit bored or when I want to distract myself a little bit, begins to quieten down as the practice takes hold. And we enter a state more and more of what's called samadhi, and this is what's translated as right meditation, and also gives its name to this pillar as well, samadhi. Sam means to join together two things that have drifted apart, and that joining together are those two bits of consciousness that have become divorced. So the physical and the mental becomes as one. And this is what happens when we make that right effort to give myself. When I give myself wholeheartedly, and suddenly that oneness for a while is attained, and out of that oneness springs the awareness. It is not that I am aware. It is not that I am watching myself, but that there's a real at oneness, like the horse and the good rider, or like the good driver in the car, or the rider on the motorbike, who goes, or even on an ordinary bike. If we've got that real skill, and if we go a little, if we do those sort of bikes that go off track and go over rough terrain. I mean, you can't be thinking about your holiday and what you're going to be having for dinner and what you're going to watch on TV tonight when you're coursing down uneven territory or uneven terrain. You have to be wholly at one there. And this is, of course, why people like doing those things, because actually the experience of samadhi is wonderful, is blissful. It's not always easy. But and when I say blissful, blissful in the sense of vitality, of really feeling alive, a real sense of life in the moment arises from it. And this is why people do it. as well, because it draws consciousness together, it draws the heart together into that oneness, and there's an experience of the tremendous strength and power that is in that unified consciousness. And of course with it, my goodness, a lot of things can be done as well. So that's our quite a quick overview of the Noble Eightfold Path, the path to the ending of suffering, the path to nirvana. There's a little bit more detail to it than that, but I think for now that gives us a sufficient taste, and hopefully a few pointers as to how to take it into our daily life and begin to apply it as well. Zenji, Tiger, Shigen, Zenji, Gisen, Zenrai, Zenji, Kosen, Soan, Zenji, Kogaku, Soen, Zenji, Tetsuo, So, Katsu, Zenji, Suigen, So, Zeka, Zenji, Seso, Soho, Zenji, Dayu, Myokyo, Zenji.